So our next speaker is Sorana Ionescu from ISO. And
hi everyone. Hope you all had a very pleasant journey to beautiful Victoria here. I haven't been here in quite a few years, so it's a pleasure to be back. My name is Sorana Ionescu. I am currently the acting Vice President of Information and Technology Services for the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. And prior to this role, about 3 months ago, Director of the Smart Metering Entity. Let me just figure this out first. Okay. Alrighty. So I have the pleasure of talking to you about a very important topic for Ontario, and that is leveraging the value of the smart meter data. I'll give you a little bit of an overview about myself, a little bit of an overview about IESO, and if I start talking in acronyms too much, please stop me and remind me. And then I'll talk to you about the project itself. So first of all, in case you're wondering where the accent is coming from, I was born in Transylvania, so that's a Romanian accent. Very close to Dracula's castle. The ones who know what ice cream is not my comfort food, just to make it very clear and creepy. We immigrated to Canada 18 years ago, so and when we came here, I actually joined the banking system. And it was while I was working for a major bank that I acquired a taste for complex analytics, and really my job was to break the silos within the banks and bring together a whole bunch of data from various sides of the bank, whether it was the debit side, the credit side, investments, etc., and just make sense of the customer profile. So when I actually came to the energy sector, I was quite surprised to see how far behind the energy sector was in comparison with the banks. So it's been a little bit of my mission to, over the last few years, to actually start making sense of the data that we currently have, and we're not leveraging enough. A little bit about the ISO, the Independent Electricity System Operator. That's kind of the equivalent of BC Hydro here. We actually have more than just one local utility in Ontario. We have now about 62. There is a consolidation trend that's happening, but let's just say that there's a lot of people that we have to work with. These 62 local distribution companies, I will refer to them as LDCs. They're they're non-homogeneous, let's put it that way. Some of them have 1 million plus customers, others have a few thousand customers. So it's quite a broad spectrum. We are in the business of keeping the lights on. And we do that by looking at the next 5 minutes and at the next 50 years. So it's a very complex, a very broad mandate for the ISO. Conservation is a very important part of our business. We have energy efficiency targets that we want to accomplish over the next years. We're very engaged in working with our regulator. It's the Ontario Energy Board. You'll hear me talking about the OEB, ministry, federal or provincial type of organizations, and a lot of stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement is a huge part of our business. And we are in discussions with pretty much every beating heart of the province by nature of our mandate. So where does the smart metering entity come in, essentially? About 13 years ago, the government of Ontario embarked on a very ambitious journey, and that was to implement time of use in the province. With that, install smart meters at pretty much every residence and small commercial customer. It was quite an undertaking, and Ontario was a pioneer in that field, which means that you pay all the price of being a pioneer, but at the same time you have an advantage in terms of how you learn about this business and how you can apply the learnings in the following years. The smart metering entity was created as it's a quasi-independent group of the ISO that we're governed by our own fee, and we have our own budget and our own, let's say, organization being part of the ISO. And we are in the business, or we were in the business, of simply supporting those 62 LDCs that I mentioned about with time of use billing. So what's happening is the LDCs are passing on and you see a little, let me try this. No? Okay. Whoa, this is technology. Okay. So this essentially shows how the data is being passed on from the local distribution company. It goes into some very sophisticated computers. It then comes into the so-called MDMR, that's the meter data management repository. What happens there, there's a processing, we call it the VEE, validation, estimation, editing, and then the data goes back to the LDCs, and then it's being translated into bills, the electricity bills. It's a very rigorous, very consistent process. To give you a sense of the magnitude of the MDMR, we're processing between 100 and 120 million transactions on a daily basis. I once looked at the Visa business and I realized that, whoa, we have essentially 1/3 of the global Visa transactions at a speed that is 1/3 faster than Visa. So that's to give you a sense of the volume and the velocity of the data in the MDMR. It's a pretty impressive operation. So we've been collecting this data for the last 10 years or so, and we haven't done much with it except for that core function that I mentioned before, time of use billing. So just when I joined the smart metering entity, and that was late fall 2015, we were in the process of submitting our license application, and we thought it was going to be a bit of a no-brainer process. We'll just submit, we'll ask for a new 5-year license renewal, and we're going to get that, and life will move on. Lo and behold, here comes December, I think, 2015, we receive the answer from our regulator. And the answer wasn't quite straightforward. Essentially, the OEB said, well, you're not going to get your 5-year license. You're going to get a 1-year license, and during this 1 year, you have to prove that you can actually make sense out of the data in the MDMR. It's been long enough. You've been collecting this for 10 years. The smart metering entity was originally set up with a higher mandate in mind. What have you done about this? So that sent a very, very strong signal, not only to us, but also to the industry as to how things were supposed to move forward. We scratched our heads, we woke up from, a little bit of the shock, and then we thought, okay, so how are we going to make this happen? The first thing that we did was we set up a working group that was formed with the key stakeholders. These were 13 local distribution companies that we thought will have a good voice in the discussion. And we spent the next few months figuring out a path to collect the information, to collect additional information from the LDCs as per the OEB order. Essentially, those were some additional fields: postal code, distributor rate class, commodity rate class, occupant change. All these fields are very important for segmentation and proper analysis. So we set a path for doing that in a privacy-compliant manner. But before we started anything, we actually went and we spoke to the IPC, that's the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. And we consulted with them, and they said, you'd better hire someone who knows what they're talking about, because this is a very big project. So that's when we turned to Privacy Analytics and Khaled, and we asked for a little bit of help to put this project together. And it was the first phase. We looked at the data that would come in, this additional data that would come into the MDMR. How are we going to ensure all the privacy requirements as that data comes in? And then by the end of the year, we were actually compliant with the OEB order. The LDCs were able to wrap their head around the fact that now they had to send us some additional information. It had to be in a certain format. It had to meet certain requirements. And by the end of the year, we were actually 100% compliant, so which means that we had pretty much all this additional data that the OEB order asked us for. So the OEB was very pleased. At the end of that year, they renewed our license for 5 years. They commended the efforts, and they said, okay, so what's next? And next really is building a path towards third-party access to this enhanced data in the MDMR. And so again, that was the beginning of last year. Again, we took a moment. We thought about, okay, so how are we going to do this? And the first thing, again, that came to mind is, we have to have our governance figured out. It's the project before the project, really. So we dissolved the previous working group, which was fairly narrow because it only included local distribution companies. And we set up a data strategy advisory council that still included LDC. So there's about 6 seats in that council out of 13, I believe. But the rest of the stakeholders in that group are people from various other industries. So we brought in a very, I would say, balanced, and in some cases they're quite 180 degrees, voices into a council that will give us the input that we need to make decisions as we move forward from a third-party access perspective. And again, we turned to the experts to help us with the analysis as to how we're going to make this platform go live. Again, governance is extremely important, and before we started to do anything, we thought about, okay, so what are the principles that we're going to uphold as we start thinking about this project, and we're starting to give it some meaning. And we consulted on these principles. We consulted with the IPC, we consulted with our Data Strategy Advisory Council, with a number of people out there, and we agreed on a few things that we thought, these will always be the acid test as to, when we have questions around how are we moving forward with the project, we'll always go back to these principles and we'll ask these questions. First of all, purpose and governance. So this is about adding value to the customer and the system. It's about maintaining perspective and long-term vision in mind. It's about walking before running. Taking a phased approach is really important. It's also very important not to impact the core function. The reason that we can actually do all this fantastic work is because we have this solid data repository in our hands. We have to keep protecting that asset and keep enhancing it. Operational effectiveness is something extremely important as a government agency. Make sure you use existing systems, add resiliency to other systems, to the systems that you currently have. Think before you build or buy anything new, and create efficiencies that are extremely important, because someone will have to obviously pay for all this effort. And last but not least, probably first, data stewardship. So this is really the commitment to data quality, service standards. It's something that we're used to because we're in the business of supporting LDC. So for us, having service level agreements and ensuring the reliability of a system, it's kind of the bread and butter. But also very, very important, being able to look at the data lifecycle approach from inception to destruction, from A to Z. You must have that 100-degree view. And to anchor this all, privacy by design and compliance with privacy is extremely important. I think what gave us a little bit of an edge in the effort was the fact that when the MDMR was first built many years ago, privacy by design was incorporated into the build. It was some of the early efforts of our previous privacy commissioner, Dr. Ann Kavukian, who took an interest in the topic itself and actually provided some very important guidance as to how we built the MDMR. I would say we were able to leverage that investment, that original investment, for the years to come, and we can actually do the work that we're currently doing because we have that very healthy foundation of privacy by design. So now we have to wrap our head around how are we going to build this roadmap for third-party access. And we realized as we went through the discussions, the effort that, privacy is one angle and it's extremely important, but the current privacy commissioner brought a couple more angles into the conversation, and that is fairness and ethics. And we'll have to wrap our head around what exactly these mean in our business. These are concepts that are extremely important, and they're very prevalent in other areas, such as the medical field is essentially the best example in this. But we also have to think about these areas. We have developed an approach that is legally and statistically defensible, consultative. It is aligned to public good outcomes and achieved through third-party access. We thought a lot about the value chain. I think when Khaled mentioned the importance of establishing social legitimacy with these efforts, this is a very good example of how we wanted to make it intentional as to how we're going to map the value chain from the beginning to the end. This is really, it starts with the Ontario residents paying for electricity, that initial investment in the MDMR that was made years ago, and how this investment now is going to materialize into some public goods, some outcomes of this data. And then obviously underpinning this effort is how we're going to build the process to ensure this, from approving, registering a third-party recipient, to going through the de-identification process, providing all the data in accordance to a contract, and then monitoring and performing audits as needed. These slides will be made available, so in case you cannot read everything, no worries. Establishing the flow of the information is also extremely important, and these three slides, three boxes depict the stages of the information in our system, and then how are we going to make it available to third parties. So the first box depicts the LDC, that's the local distribution company, and how the smart meter data collected for the time of use billing, which is the primary use of this data, along with the additional data elements that I mentioned to you about, the postal code, distributor rate class, commodity rate class, occupancy data gets passed on to us. It's partially de-identified before it's being loaded into the ISO's repository, that's the MDMR. The second box essentially depicts the ISO as the data recipient from the LDCs. It's further identified by the LDCs. The uniques are, some of the uniques on the postal codes are being scrapped right from the start. And then essentially it's the path towards the third parties analysis, which entails additional privacy analysis before the data it's actually is made available to a third party, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I mentioned about the building a roadmap for third-party access to the smart meter data in Ontario, and there's a couple of slides that will show you that roadmap. This is one picture of the roadmap that shows the three different angles that we have looked at in detail in terms of defining the processes, the technologies, and the people that will have to be part of this important business model. There's quite a few steps that we'll have to ensure for each and every one of these angles. When you look at processes, obviously we need to have standard operating procedures, data sharing agreements, centralized disclosure reporting and tracking, etc., etc. When you look at the people, understanding the data use needs development of the identification strategies, communication internally and externally is extremely important. And then when you look at technologies, I'm not going to go through the whole list, I just wanted to give you some examples. It's really the automation for risk determination. We're looking at information security controls, and then the post-measurement side of it as well. What we have learned as we started to put together these concepts is that this cannot be an SME, a smart metering entity, single process. It has to be looked at the enterprise level. So we are now looking at the ISO overall as to how we're going to give life to these principles as we're starting to build the path towards third-party access, and realizing that ISO itself is a third party actually participating. There are quite a few areas of the ISO that have a keen interest in the data in the MDMR, and we have to wrap our head around as to how we're going to enable our own company to actually get access to the data. It's quite an interesting conundrum. This is the same roadmap, but it's shown into a calendar view, and it depicts the same three key angles, the processes, people, and technologies. But this is essentially showing how we're going to undertake this effort over the next 18 plus months. I'll probably say we are somewhere here. So we've completed the pilot phase, so we're quite advanced, and we're almost going into I would say we are going into the implementation phase. Each and every one of the boxes on this screen is a project in itself. That's how complex it is. And again, we have taken the time and the consultative approach to make sure that these concepts are being properly stakeholder, properly discussed, properly researched, and properly communicated, which is a key component of this whole effort. So I mentioned a little bit about pilots. As we were talking to the members of the Data Strategy Advisory Council, we said, okay, we need to start actually trying our hand at what is this all about, third-party access. So the members of the council have actually provided some test cases to us to start understanding all the implications of actually being able to give them access to the data. And we had submissions from the Ontario Energy Board, who obviously is very interested in understanding patterns of energy use for better pricing models. We had a lot of interest from municipalities, and both our municipalities members in the council have actually submitted requests. And we also realized through this effort that municipalities are probably going to be one of our biggest users as we move forward. They all have, or most of them have, green energy plans. They need to establish baselines. They don't want to work with necessarily with 62 LDCs or whatever the number of LDCs are in their constituency. They want to come to one source of data that's been already validated, that it's reliable, and they need to move fast. So that's where the interest of municipalities is coming in. And I expect we're going to see probably even more interest now that the Smart Cities Challenge has been launched. And this is a federal initiative, and I already heard that there's quite a few municipalities in Ontario that are willing to participate. And again, they really need data first to establish the baseline, and then to understand how they progress towards whatever targets they will be progressing. Enbridge Gas, one of our two gas providers in Ontario, we have Union and Enbridge, are also very interested in establishing load profiles to actually help predict greenhouse gas emissions. So climate change is a very important topic, as we all know. Greenhouse gas emissions is a very important area for us to look into, and people actually want to exploit the electricity consumption data to understand that area. I mentioned ISO, and this is outside the smart metering entity. So our planners, whether they're looking at short-term planning or long-term planning, they're very interested in understanding, getting a better handle of the consumption data. That is becoming even more important now that distributed energy resources, or the DERs, are becoming more and more prevalent. So what's happening in the control room? The control room is losing visibility on the ground because people are installing solar panels. We're talking about electric cars, we're talking about storage, we're talking about a number of distributed energy resources that don't have visibility on the wall in the control room. So this is where being able to leverage these granular data actually has a lot of potential for short-term and long-term planning. And then we had also requests from the Ontario Clean Water Agency. They wanted to understand energy savings opportunities for their 800 plus water and wastewater treatment collection facilities. What was very interesting, so this took about a few months actually to complete, and again we had Privacy Analytics helping us with the effort for understanding what are the requirements for de-identification for each and every test case. What we learned is that each and every case was different, and although they were kind of formulated in the same way because they were really asking for data by postal codes, by a certain geography, because of the different nature, different risk nature of each and every requester, it was probably felt like each and every one is an effort in itself. The observations were organized by case type. Some people asked for aggregated data, some have asked for row-level data. One general observation, for aggregated requests, there must be a minimum of 5 premises that will be included, so you can't go below 5. For low-level data, it becomes a little more sophisticated, because the method needs to ensure no unique records. We have to avoid leaking information about individual premises through inferences, maintaining a minimum group again, or equivalence class, and averaging the consumption data to make sure that we're not creating de-identification opportunities by looking at outliers. And I will invite Khaled and Sarah to come in if they want to add anything on this. They are the experts on these test cases. So we've completed the test cases. We're almost at the point where we should be able to start sharing that information with the third-party requesters. We're in the process of completing the legal agreements that will have to go with the data sharing, of course. We would like to have another discussion with the IPC. We've been keeping the IPC very closely involved in these conversations, and it's important that we regroup together. And I have to tell you, it's as a personal observation, the IPC has been incredibly supportive of these efforts. And you know what was really refreshing when we were talking to them earlier in our efforts was that they see themselves as enablers of being able to do this kind of analysis as opposed to barriers. And they kept reminding us that they're there to help us do these kind of things and achieve the public good outcomes that are meant to come from the use of this data while ensuring that privacy is properly protected. There is one big chapter as well that we need to figure out before we can actually launch broad scale. And I call this the costing and valuation model. I initially started with calling it a monetization model, but people thought that this is just about charging money, so we pulled back a little bit and we tried to give it a different meaning. But it's really about figuring out who pays for what and establishing the value proposition, the value of the data that we're talking about. It's going to be quite an art and science. I would say, especially when you're doing it for the first time, you're writing the book, so there's there's parallels from other industry, but you don't have a book for your own industry. So we'll have to figure that part out before we can actually enable third-party access. So that's happening over the next few months. And then we're very keen to start the implementation phase. The hope is that by the end of 2018, we'll have this figured out. There will be not only the uses that we've demonstrated through the pilots, but we're hoping that we're going to see a number of people that will raise their hand and will ask for the data. I think, sorry, going back. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. Again, in terms of key takeaways, I would say very important to engage with the privacy commissioners early in the process. Make sure that you have the right experts in the room with you. Make sure that you establish a proper consultative model. Stakeholder engagement and communication are probably the most important areas that need to be looked at when it comes to these types of efforts. And then taking that enterprise-wide approach when you're establishing policies and you're establishing processes as we move forward. It's going to be an interesting journey, and I thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass it on.